what we always asked our daughter was, who do you want to be when you grow up? And that who is going to last your whole life. I think if you get the who right, the what's will change through your life, but that who is with you your whole time.
Welcome to Technoventure. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Mike Hayes. Mike is a managing director at Insight Partners, where he collaborates with growth stage and late stage software companies to accelerate value creation. Prior to Insight Partners, Mike served as chief operating officer of VMware, where he oversaw global business operations, enterprise technology, data and analytics strategy, automation, M&A integration, and the company's transition to a SaaS-led model. He played a pivotal role in the acquisition of VMware by Broadcom for $94 billion. Prior to VMware, Mike held senior leadership positions at Cognizant Technology Solutions and at Bridgewater Associates, and he spent 20 years as a U.S. Navy SEAL, culminating in his command of SEAL Team 2, and served as a White House Fellow and Director of Defense Policy and Strategy at the National Security Council under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Mike's widely recognized for blending leadership disciplines with operational rigor. He underscores technology's potential to elevate society's standards of living and create real meaning and impact. He's the author of a phenomenal book called Never Enough. He and I have been on the record about that previously, but his latest book is Mission Driven: The Path to a Life of Purpose. And I should mention, Mike gives all book royalties from his books to the 1162 Foundation, so named because the Navy SEALs were formed by President Kennedy on January 1st of 1962. And the foundation supports Gold Star families. He's paid off 12 mortgages to date for those families, among the many admirable things that he has done for people he knows and people he does not. Mike, welcome to Technoventure. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Peter, pleasure's mine. I just love any time we get together. I'm always so impressed by the impact and the inspiration that you have. And this is the best hour of my, day, week, year. So thank you for having me.
You're so kind to say that, Mike, and yeah, the honor is certainly mine. Well, let's talk about the genesis of Mission Driven. In some ways, this was the logical successor to the prior book. You were getting feedback from those who read the book and enjoyed the book about kind of getting deeper into some of the themes associated with it. I mentioned, of course, the acquisition of VMware by Broadcom, which gave you a little bit of a rare time off to reflect and to think. And so the combination of some of that feedback and a bit of time to reflect on this sounds like it culminated in the writing of the book. Can you talk a bit about the genesis behind it?
I'd love to. Thanks for asking. Peter, I'm really just driven to share. I recognize that I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of once in a lifetime experiences. So, really, to me, what a lot of near death experiences teach you is that we are on the planet to help each other be better, to have more impact, and serve, really ultimately serve each other. So the coming off, like you said, coming off of Never Enough, I had lots of questions that were things like, Mike, amazing book, but what does meaning really mean? Or what is impact? Or how do you make it practical? And it's you're an author, when you get that book written, you're like, I'm done, I can rest. And I felt that way for a short period of time, but over the months and years after I wrote Never Enough, the pile of questions and stuff just got larger and larger. And look, the way to have nonlinear impact for this for people is to write, record, create some sort of a content. And that way, ultimately, you can help people that you've never met. And so the genesis of the book really was to continue to help.
Yeah, very interesting. You've mentioned that in raising your daughter, you never asked her what she wanted to be. You asked her who she wanted to be, and that mindset is something, and that lesson is a central lesson of Mission Driven. How do you encourage people to uncover who they truly are or should be or want to be before focusing on what they want to do? Since of course it's only natural to think first about the what as opposed to the who.
Yeah, it's funny. Our daughter's 24 years old now, and when she was growing up, I used to hear all these parents saying and relatives and saying, what do you want to be? What do you want to be when you grow up? And it's like, gosh, these kids just can't really answer that question. And so the what is a question that is connected to identity, to some sort of like a profession or even a school or something like that. But these chapters in life are always fleeting. The thing that carries through our whole life is our character, our values, our, how we treat people, our work ethic, how we stay calm when things are hard, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I always what we always asked our daughter was, who do you want to be when you grow up? And that who is going to last your whole life. I think if you get the who right, the what's will change through your life, but that who is with you your whole time. So how do you find that? That's really ultimately what mission driven is about, is figuring out, what is your mission, and then how do you achieve it. Peter, as you know, I've spent 20 years in the Navy SEALs. I've been the director of defense policy and strategy for Bush and Obama. So I've run or attended hundreds of meetings in the White House Situation Room, and done the all the highs and lows of everything that our nation has asked of SEALs. You know this, but I've been shot at, I've been rocketed, I've jumped out of a building rig to explode, I've been held at gunpoint and threatened with execution. I've amputated a teammate's leg on an operation. It's just like I've lived the highs and the lows of everything. And with that, the most important thing is to really to recognize that how much we've been given. And so for me, I'm really driven to ultimately give back.
Yeah, really amazing. And tell me, when did you begin to ask yourself that question about the who?
Yeah, so well, I'm fortunate to have a grandfather who was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 41, and a father who was a lifelong naval officer, and neither of them pushed me into the Navy. What they did was just exemplified and modeled a life of service. So I grew up seeing what service really means, and it's funny. I think that's like I'm not one to necessarily give parenting advice to anybody, but in my own aspiration to be the best father I can be, it's not telling your kids what to do. It's modeling what to do, and how to, like I just said, stay calm when things are hard, or to use all of those really hard things that we've been through that I just listed to understand that those are opportunities. You see, when things get really hard, you really get to figure out who you are. And a lot of times when things get hard in business, we tend to think to ourselves, we have an excuse for things to be suboptimal, but that's really the wrong way to think about it. It's antithetical to what good leaders do, which is to use that as an opportunity to say, I have a really hard situation in front of me. This is an opportunity to prove who I am. Not, I mean, of course, everybody else, but that's not the important thing. It's most important for yourself.
Very interesting. And how does the idea apply to companies as well as individuals? We're talking about the individual application by and large so far in the conversation. How do you encourage CEOs and executive teams to contemplate the same as a group of individuals ultimately?
I just think personifying the organization is the way to do it. I mean, ultimately, every enterprise has an identity and can be treated as an individual entity. So I really don't see much difference between the individual and the collective organization. When you think about like organizations, a lot of times they tend to take on the personalities of their leaders. What does the boss prioritize, deprioritize? What are those characteristics and traits that are important to the leaders of the organization, and the rest of the organization tends to try to want to please or perform in the way that the vision and the leadership has crafted. That's why I really do think that, I like to say leaders gain authority by giving it away. And so when it comes to, things that can go wrong in an organization, I feel like most of that comes from just lack of focus or alignment around the vision or the goals. So if I walked into your business, or a large enterprise, and said, "Hey, write down the company's mission on a 3x5 statement." In other words, the who the company wants to be. Half the first half will be largely the same, but the last half is going to drift all over the map. But by converging the organization around that vision and goals, that's how you really drive elite performance.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Mike. In the book, Mission Driven, you present a diagram of three circles: what gives you energy, what you're good at, and what the business needs. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you advise people to find the overlap there, especially when their passions maybe don't perfectly align with their current roles, for instance.
Yeah, thanks for drawing that out for sure. Like, look, we've at this point, I think most of your audience has hired plenty of people, and so by definition, if we're at the hiring table and I'm the hiring manager, I'm supposed to know what we need. Otherwise, why am I there? The other two circles, the what are you good at and what gives you energy, are the most important too. And what I find is that when you're hiring somebody, they all know what they're good at and maybe 30 or 300% more than they're good at. But what people have a harder time answering is what gives you energy. And so to your earlier question of like, why did I write mission driven? People asked for things to be a little bit more practical. And so there are a couple of thought exercises sprinkled throughout the book. And one of those is very simply like, imagine you and I in the elevator and we've got 30 seconds of a ride and I say, hey Peter, how are you? And by the way, who are you? When we have to answer who are we, it's very hard to answer that in 5 or 7 tight, succinct sentences because we don't have the deeper thinking necessarily figured out quite yet. And so it's a hard question to answer, but by forcing that, you really understand what you prioritize. What do you converge your own mission statement around? And therefore, your actions can all nest just like the organizational design that's a waterfall where everybody's got their roles and responsibilities. And ultimately, you've got different actions that you take that support the overall objectives of the organization. Well, that works for us as individuals too. We all have more demands on our time than we can possibly ever, satisfy. So, Peter, there's a million people that want your time. How do you think about what you say no to? And that's really where I think a lot of the answers lie for us as both individuals and collective organizations.
Mike, you also write that the best leaders are those who can give themselves feedback without judgment or emotion. Talk a bit about that. I said some of the anecdotes that you've shared, I think, are really powerful. And again, in some ways, counterintuitive, or at least not necessarily the natural way in which we think about giving ourselves feedback.
Yeah, Peter. Well, what we do in SEAL training is to stretch people beyond their limits and then get them comfortable. Stretch them beyond their limits again, comfort, et cetera, et cetera. And what that sounds like is an exercise in just stretching your limits. It's true, but what it really is an exercise in getting really good and used to working in discomfort. So, no two situations will ever be the same. And so, practicing for a specific situation doesn't really work. What works is building that foundational ability to deal with chaos, ambiguity, asymmetric information, high pressure, high stakes, people around you that are acting anything from irrationally to unethically. And so, like when you're in those situations, like Navy SEALs, all know how to operate in that sort of environment because that's what we train for. So I think that the way to growth is really figuring out after you go through something to say, what can or should I have done differently? And whenever something's done, you know, I, there's always room for improvement. Maybe there's a lot of room for improvement, maybe there's a little room for improvement, but it's never no room for improvement. And so how do you number one figure out what that potential improvement is? And then number two is not go look at the rest of the world and say, what could the rest of the world have done differently, but what could I have done differently? And I might be 100% wrong or 1% wrong, but I'm never 0% wrong. So by focusing on my 100% or 1%, that's where that improvement is to say, gosh, I could have made a better decision. I could have communicated differently. I should have solicited more input to the decision, things like that. And so by being genuinely objective about your decisions and your actions, and then reflective is where the special sauce is. A quick thing to highlight on that too, though, is I find that the world judges actions way too much when we should be judging intent. Like I as a human fall short many times, but so while I fall short, my intention rarely falls short. I very rarely, if ever, walk into a situation and have malintent. And so when I could have done something better, Peter, I want you to give me that feedback and say, hey, Mike, I think you could have done this, that, or the other thing better. But what we shouldn't be doing is focusing solely on that action, but we should say, hey, Mike's intentions were good. Let's give him the grace that that he deserves because he just fell short in his actions, not his intent.
Yeah. You also in the book you talk about what you refer to as the long game, who you want to become. We've discussed some of that, but also the short game, how you act on that, and talk a little bit about the balance between those two, and how you think about that.
Life is long. And so what I find is that a lot of people optimize for the now. And, I'm a person who believes in giving in non-transactional ways. If I help you, I don't need something back. It's not like, oh, Peter, sure, I can do this, but what can you do for me? That is the worst mindset that you can possibly have. I believe that when two organizations are trying to come together and be partners, you're not keeping score over the short term. My mentality is if I can reach more than 51% across the table, and I'm with somebody else who wants to reach more than 51% of across the table, you can find that zone of intersection quite easily. And if I'm your partner, my only goal is to make you successful. And if I pick the right partners, their goal is to make me successful. And that's the way I think of what partnership in life is, both from a business standpoint and a personal standpoint. So I think that that long game part of it is really emphasizing the non-transactional focus that we all should have.
Yeah, really interesting. When you left both military and government service, you were 41. You joined Bridgewater. You went from commanding 2,000 people to having no direct reports. What did that experience teach you about ego, identity, some of the themes we're talking about here? What a dramatic change of experience that was, obviously, into a completely new and different field as well.
Yeah, fantastic question. The Like I said earlier, if your identity is a what and not a who, you're going to live the highs and the lows of life that'll be very spiky. When I'm a commander of a SEAL team, I'm super cool. The world thinks I'm cool. I'm Billy Badass. Walk into a room, everybody knows that's the commanding officer. But you know what? That's a 2.5 year tour of duty for me. If I think I'm more important than I really am during that 2.5 years, when I'm not that person, then the lows can get really a lot lower. And so what I really encourage people to do is really think about don't anchor on whether you, like you point out, have no direct reports and you're in charge of the pencils. And so like I I've aspired, and I think one thing I've done decently in my life is not to let those highs get so high and then the lows aren't so low. I've cycled in and out of jobs that the world would say are some jobs that the world would say are really, really important. And then other times I've been the thing that the world could say, hey, that's an absolute nobody. You don't spend any time with him. And I think that's also how you figure out who your real friends and partners are, like I was previously describing.
Yeah, many leaders, Mike, struggle with decisiveness, especially when stakes are high or information is incomplete. Talk a bit about what you refer to as getting comfortable with making decisions and ways in which and practices people might put into place in order to become more comfortable.
Yeah, well, Peter, I think the first decision in decision making is actually not the decision itself, it's when to make a decision. And I think a lot of people get that wrong. And I'm somebody who has made, I'll just, I've decided what risk our nation's sons and daughters assume for the nation, and what operations do we go on, and when do we drop bombs from an aircraft onto the ground. And I don't say this with like pride or boastfulness because I don't feel that way, but I've had to make 1,100 plus life-ending decisions, and I'm proud to say that we've never harmed anybody we shouldn't harm. And how does that happen? It comes from a decision-making process. And I've thought a lot about the framework for making decisions, and this is true not just commanding officer of a SEAL, but in business. Whether it's, ultimately what does a business do? You're really deciding capital allocation. If you have $100, how much are you allocating to product, how much to sales, and how much to operations, very simplistically, or things like that. And those capital allocation decisions really can they're exactly identical to whether you drop a bomb on an operation in Afghanistan or Iraq. And the way to think about the when for me is that my job as the leader is to get the best, the fastest, best, highest quality inputs, and then at some point to recognize that the time associated with getting more information, higher quality inputs costs you more than the marginal incremental utility of that extra information. At that point, that you hit that inflection point where the time costs you more than the benefit of more information, that's when to make the decision. Now, sometimes that's 20 seconds, sometimes that's 2 weeks. But by thinking about that and saying when is your information kind of inflection point happening? So from there, I think that you really need to surround yourself with people who don't think like you. And the reason that we never harmed anybody we shouldn't harm is because I separated myself ultimately from being the input and the decider, because I am by definition the decider, and I always have an opinion. So if my input always equals the decision, then why am I listening to anybody else? And so I need that ability to separate those two views. And at times I'll call it, lack of ego or the humility to be able to recognize that my input is different than the decision we should make. So out of 1,000+ times that we drop bombs, I'd say at least five of those times we either did or didn't. The action we took was different from my input. And I mean, I could tell you a story where that saved lives because I changed my mind. And I think that's getting comfortable in your own skin is ultimately when is the essential ingredient for leadership. It's like when you're in front of a room and you can say things like, I was wrong, or hey, you did that better than I am, or you're better suited to make that decision than I am. Like just because I'm the senior person in the room, or classically, what's that say? Hippo, the highest paid, whatever, highest paid person in the room, or whatever that saying is. Like that doesn't matter. What matters is who's the person with the best experience to make the decision, and who's got the closest proximity to the problem or the opportunity that you're working on.
Yeah, well articulated. Your book is in many ways oriented towards people at transition points, whether it's graduating from with a degree, professional shifting roles, people who are questioning success or purpose. What do you see as some of the main mistakes that people make when they have these pivots in their career or life missions, and how do you recommend avoiding them?
Yeah, I guess great question. I've never been asked it that way. My quick answer is I think there are two main mistakes that I see. Number one is people are in a situation and they realize they don't want to be in the situation they're in anymore, and therefore they decide that they need to run away from what they're at, where they are. Well, running away from something is not the right way to think about something. You want the destination. So have the patience. I'm terrible at patience, and so when I'm in a situation like that, which I have been, then as reflexively as I'd love to run away from that situation I'm in, how can I have the patience to go search out my two so that I can have that destination? My econ professor in grad school used to say, Mike, beware of fast trains to the wrong station. And it's like I classically can end up at the wrong station. So I think that's one of the mistakes. Peter, the second mistake I see people make is how would I describe this? I feel like people think bottom up instead of top down. What happens is, for example, I've counseled like hundreds of people getting out of the SEAL teams. I get the call of like, hey, Mike, either they know me or they know of me, and like, hey, you've had some success in the commercial world. To help me understand how to transition. And honestly, that was part of the genesis of writing Mission Driven. It was to the mistake that I see a lot of these people have is that they'll say, Mike, I've got this thing in front of me. I know a guy or a gal who has a thing, and they've got one opportunity in front of themselves, and they're evaluating that one thing in front of themselves. But what I advocate in Mission Driven is to really step back and say, if you are going to transition, first of all, think agnostically of any sort of a next role and work and understand the deeper objectives of what you're going to do. We all have different motivations and interests and passions and skills and abilities. And so, mine aren't yours and yours aren't mine. And so for me to tell you what I think you should do introduces the bias of like, you should think what I think. That's terrible. What my goal is to help you connect your passions, your desires, your interests to whatever, gives you energy, like we talked about before. So I think the way to think about it is to develop some sort of a framework, and I won't go into it here, but I offer it in the book to help people draw out what is important to them: geography, compensation, industry, role, type of organization, quality of life, things like that, and force rank those and do that thinking. And if you are going to search, then go search and develop 10 different ideas and pick from 10 things that match your goals in where you want to go. Don't just react to that one thing in that bottom up kind of way.
Mike, a thread between both of your books is the whole notion of finding enough. Your first book was called Never Enough, and you note also in your second book the necessity of finding enough in the ways you spend your time. You alluded earlier to the there are a million pulls on each of our times, and learning how to say no. I also you also point out frankly that the pursuit of money sometimes becomes the ends as opposed to the means, and sort of that the logic associated with that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Talk a bit about how you recommend people find enough and define that enough in a productive way.
So first of all, I have to say that my mom hated the title Never Enough. She's like, Michael, why in the world am I going to buy a book that says I'm never enough? And I was like, well, Mom, I think you're going to buy it no matter what. But but no, but the point is, you have to live in two worlds at once. And I kind of tackled this in the beginning of Never Enough, which is, and this is true for Mission Driven also, but it's how do you live in the world of like seeking to be the best you can, but simultaneously giving yourself the grace that in the Latin, don't over excessively pressure yourself for perfection, and understanding when is the pressure good and when is the pressure bad, and always having that dial set appropriately. But I think that uh, enough is a really interesting question because it connects back to purpose. What is your purpose? And what I find is that people who can better connect their purpose and what gives them energy to how they're spending their life, the less something feels like work. I listen to you regularly, and you have so many incredible, accomplished like CIOs and technology leaders come on who are clearly like in their element and doing what they were, I'll say, like born to do. It's just like, oh my gosh, I'm so thankful that this person or that person is the leader in that organization. And it's clear that it doesn't even sound like work. I know it's work, but but it doesn't sound like work because they're having fun. And I think that fun can be different things for different people. It could be like, am I learning and getting better? Or am I helping others to be better? Or am I creating outcomes for my organization? And so I think that the definition of enough has to be analyzed one deeper level, because like I'll be honest, like I think about, like, you just said about money, like how much money is enough? When do you really have that freedom to go do whatever you want? Those how do any of us think of that? We're all wrestling with how to think about these types of questions. How, like, it doesn't just have to be money. It could be like, how much of the 90-hour work weeks? I love the job. I've got a really good friend right now who's a chief security officer of a really big consequential place, who's like doing work that no one else could, like very few people on the planet could appreciate, because of the non-nation state and the nation state actors. And this person is really world class, and privately is like, man, I'm just getting burned out, and I love the contribution I'm making, but it's super hard and it's taxing on me and my family. So that's a question of like, when do you trade off like what you're really good at and what you're doing versus the other dimensions? And I think these are hard questions. And if there's anything I've found, it's that the best thing to do is talk to friends who know you and ask them their opinion, because they know you, sometimes better than you know yourself.
Fascinating response, Mike. Thank you for those reflections. The book also points to humility as a leadership superpower. And as someone who's honored to call you a friend, you certainly exhibit that in all that you do. I think people who are watching or listening to this will certainly get that impression. But how do you suggest that leaders cultivate humility, especially once they've reached senior positions with visible authority?
Well, I've been, I'll say, privileged to have all these, countless, like literally life or death experiences. And what the wisdom I get from that is just the perspective to know that I'm so lucky to be here. I carry a ton of weight. I I mean, there's not a day that goes by when I don't think to myself, am I living a life that is worthy of my friend's sacrifice? I've buried 75 friends, like every SEAL of my era. Probably 15 of those guys are like brothers to me, like brothers, and that's really tough. And so you think about like, am I living, am I helping enough? And so that candidly drives me. A lot of times people will say, Mike, thank you for your service, just like they do to anybody in the military, which is greatly appreciated. It absolutely is. But I've never really said it this way publicly, but I will with you here, Peter, is that, I also simultaneously cringe a little bit when people say that to me, and not for the reason that you may think. The reason is because I'm no more important than you are. Why are you thanking me? Like I should be thanking you. We all have different passions and gifts and abilities. You've heard me say this probably too many times on this podcast already. But like why like the military doesn't have the corner market on serving. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. We are all here to serve each other. And so whether it's like the people that you have on your show here are often technology leaders, which is one of the best ways to elevate societies. Like thank you to everybody who's either been on the show or listening, who is lifting and elevating societies in ways that I didn't do as a SEAL. And so I think that real deep humility comes from really having the respect and the ability to value everybody's contributions and impact. If there's any kind of like, I've sometimes been asked like, well, what do you want out of the book Mission Driven? I want people to get off the sidelines for whatever issues they really feel passionate about and take ownership and accountability in whatever that is. Getting plastics out of the ocean, cutting fire breaks in the forest, or Teach for America. Like there are a lot of places like Israel have these, years of service where you have to do. I am such a proponent of a mandatory year of service. It really, like my grandfather told me, Mike, when you have a hard day, the only thing you can do is go help someone who's having a harder day. And I think that really, when we as humans can understand that we're here to serve each other, that's when we will have the real breakthrough and take us to the next level, both as organizations and as completely as a nation and a planet. That's what's missing.
Yeah, fantastic reflections again. Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed stories you've told about the relationship that you've built with Dan Hurley, the basketball coach at the University of Connecticut. You got to know him before he had back-to-back championships. Talk a bit about that friendship and collaboration that you've had, because I think it's a really great story.
Well, Peter, thanks. Dan, I got a call, one of those number that you didn't have programmed in your phone that all of us decline. 99.9% of the time I decline it. It was the same area code that I live in, and I don't know why I never pick them up, but for whatever reason I picked up this call, and and it was like, hey, Mike, my name's Dan Hurley. We've got a bunch of mutual friends. I just finished Never Enough, and like, dude, I need you to come talk to my team. And I live in Westport, Connecticut, and so of course I knew who Dan Hurley and the UConn basketball team was. But again, like you said, this was pre, like I bought low, and so I went up and I spoke to the team, and if anything, the only thing I failed to do was put $100 on them that at that point, because they were like 800 to 1 odds to win the national championship. So of course, I'm not necessarily advocating gambling, but that was a failure on my part. But anyways, I spoke to the team and got to know Dan, the players, and things like that. And the ability to positively impact people is amazing. And I'm actually speaking to the team very soon again, and I've done it every year since. And what's funny is after I did it the first year, Dan said, "Listen, like you got to come back," and I'm like, "Of course I'll come back." In the second year when I showed up, I said, "Listen, guys, you didn't win because of the coaching and the playing. You won because of me. I take full credit for your national championship." So we've just got a real fun jocularity back and forth. But really, what Dan is an absolute elite human being. He's got a book that's out now called Never Stop. I kid him like I got to I think he probably would have titled his Never Enough if he could have, but so he had to settle for Never Stop. But I really recommend it. He's really a guy that's pushes really hard. He's incredibly real. He doesn't hide things and gets criticized for kind of being too fiery or too eccentric from times. But he is, I've seen him at the times when the press isn't seeing him, and he is just a wonderful human being. And it's clear that like SEALs and elite athletes have a lot in common. So there's a natural simpatico.
Fascinating, really interesting. You've mentioned your grandfather a couple times as clearly somebody who's very influential on you. I wonder who else has been, from a leadership perspective, influential on you and shaped your core philosophy, so much of which now is represented in this book.
Peter, I've been really privileged to serve as a White House Fellow. If anybody's listening, go Google White House Fellowship. It is the single best formative year of my life. And what that year entails is essentially like 5,000-ish people who will apply for this program. You have to have a decent grad school under your belt. And so you're in your anywhere from upper 20s to about maybe 40 years, some kind of that's kind of the rough age range. We know there's not formal age ranges, but it's kind of like mid-career-ish program. And with the White House Fellowship, you end up spending a year placed in an atypically senior role somewhere in the executive branch. And in that year, my class was incredibly tight. And the beauty is, I have my background, but I'm with 13 other amazing classmates who have like similarly accomplished backgrounds, but very, very different. And so you get to learn from your classmates. And so I would say my White House fellow classmates is one answer to that question. But then, of course, during the course of the year, you sit down with president, vice president, every cabinet secretary, Supreme Court justices, senators, et cetera, and you ask whatever you want. And so I think that I know I'm not giving you a singular answer. I'm answering that the program itself that gave me exposure put me around multiple presidents and so many different people that that we learn from. It's just like just like whenever I've worked around anybody else, I learn what's great and I learn what I wouldn't want to emulate. I was Ray Dalio's chief of staff. I think the world of Ray Dalio. I love Ray. Ray's an eccentric, hard guy to work for. I used to joke around with Ray. I'd say, "Hey Ray, you're the IQ of a million and an EQ of zero. I'm the IQ of zero and the EQ of a million. So collectively, we make a really good professional." And but being able to work in an environment as tough as Bridgewater was really makes you better. And so that's like what we talked about earlier. Trade-offs. How much do you trade off fun for growth? Sometimes those are the two things you need to weigh. So I've just been privileged to be around a lot of different people that I've taken bits of. I would just point to Frank D'Souza as a dear, dear brother and friend of mine, who's also been incredibly influential as probably one of the founded Cognizant, built it into a Fortune 200. And I think his total shareholder return over his tenure was 37,000%, if I remember that right. You invested $1 when he took over, and then when he stepped down, that dollar turned into 37,000. I think it's the second highest TSR in the history of the universe. And I'm proud to count Frank as a really dear friend of mine.
Remarkable. Well, today you are a managing director at Insight Partners. You, as part of those responsibilities, evaluate the leadership of numerous companies that the company that is Insight might invest in. I wonder, how do you think about that now as an investor? Some of the lessons that we're talking about throughout this conversation in helping the company invest in the companies that will form the economic growth of tomorrow.
I've learned so much in my almost 2 years at Insight Partners. Of course, for those who don't know, Insight Partners is an investment management firm with 90 billion in regulatory assets under management, 600 portfolio companies, and it's all B2B software. So the being able to look at the equation from through the eyes of these incredible partners at Insight who've been investing together for a very long time. Like I said, I learn every single day. They're great at things that I will never be as great at them as. And hopefully, I'm good at things that also are complementary to the organization. And so I'm under no illusion that I'm going to wake up and have been an operator basically my whole life and all of a sudden, play investor and look at some spreadsheet and know how to get 12 more basis points out of a deal. That's not what we're doing. We're a stage agnostic firm. Jeff Horing, the founder, always reminds people like stage is not a strategy. So, but it's a growth shop. We're looking for basically high gross retention. In other words, software solutions and platforms that have very low churn. In other words, great product market fit. And then growth of like 30, 50, or 300 points higher than gross retention. And so the ability to, what I've really learned, if anything, in the last couple years is to really the focus on TAM, the total addressable market of a solution. I think I underappreciated that. One thing that I think that I appreciated more than maybe other people is that even when I came in, I said, to me, one of the most underloved metrics is time to first value. I think that TTV is really incredibly important because I've been that exec at VMware with a $3+ billion budget to spend on technology. Like I've had these small companies trying to sell to me, and when the implementation is hard, like I'm sorry, my management team, I'm just looking at the management bandwidth to go implement your solution. I just don't have time for that. I need low switching costs, and I need in a very fast time to first value. That's where the sweet spot is. And so I think between my previous experiences in life and then sitting next to a bunch of people at Insight who are incredibly smart and practiced, I've just become a little bit smarter, which I've tried to do is surround myself with people who are smarter, faster, and better than me. And that's that. If there's any secret in my life, that's what has served me well, because like being around you, Peter, over the last many years has made me better. And so I'm just thankful for those kinds of opportunities.
Well, the reverse is certainly true, Mike. I'm better for learning from you, for witnessing all that you do from a short distance. I'm honored to call you a friend, and I'm honored that you would take time with me today to share a bit more about your book. As a reminder, it is mission driven. I highly recommend it. Great lessons. Those who have been watching or listening will certainly recognize that through the many phenomenal insights that you, Mike, shared here. I'm grateful that you did. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter, for having me, and I really do appreciate the everybody who's out there understanding. Like, yeah, the mission driven is literally paying off mortgages for Gold Star families, and I make zero money from any of the books, and so the opportunity to even come in here, and this hasn't been a book conversation per se, but like I said, I carry a ton of weight, and the opportunity to help those who pay that ultimate sacrifice every single day while making a difference is really what life is about. So I appreciate you very much, Peter.